Okay, so right off the bat, we're diving into a poem that I reckon you lot might be wrestling with in your GCSE English Lit, especially if you're looking at that whole love and relationships theme.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Maura Dooley's Letters from Yorkshire.
You've hit the nail on the head there. It's a bit of a classic, isn't it? And actually, it's deceptively simple on the surface.
Yeah, it seems pretty straightforward, but there's loads going on underneath, isn't there?
Right, there's a lot to unpack. So, for anyone who hasn't come across this poem before, basically it's giving us a glimpse into this relationship between two people, right?
Yeah, and they're living totally different lives.
Yeah,
Right?
totally. And there's this distance between them, both literally and in terms of their lifestyles. You've got one person who's all about the news, probably stuck in some busy city somewhere.
Yeah, probably up to their eyeballs in headlines.
Exactly. And then the other person is out in the Yorkshire countryside, proper in touch with nature, digging gardens, that sort of thing.
Yeah, much more grounded in the natural world, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Dooley's really clever.
Oh, how so?
Well, she uses that contrast, that difference in their everyday lives, to look at something really fundamental about relationships, especially for our theme.
Go on, go on.
It's all about how we maintain that connection, that sense of affection, when our realities are so completely different and when there are actual miles between us. It really makes you question what love and relationships actually mean, doesn't it? Beyond all the socky romantic stuff we usually get fed.
It does, it does. It's like she's challenging those conventional ideas, isn't she? So let's get down to brass tacks. The poem starts with this really striking image, right? In February, digging his garden, planting potatoes.
Yeah. What hits you first about those opening lines?
I don't know, it's those verbs, isn't it? Digging, planting. It's like, bam, straight away you've got this image of someone who's active. You know, they're actually doing stuff.
It's really effective, isn't it?
Yeah.
It establishes him as this grounded figure. And it's interesting when we compare it to that later image of the speaker feeding words onto a blank screen.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. It's almost the opposite, isn't it? This person's all about action, while the speaker seems more passive, a bit more stuck. It really highlights the difference in their worlds.
And I think there's an element there of Dooley making us think about which life is more real. It's not just about description. She's making us question the value of these different ways of life right from the start.
It's true. It's like she's already planting those seeds of doubt in our minds. And then you get that lovely bit of nature thrown in, don't you? He saw the first lapwings return.
Oh, that's beautiful, isn't it? There's something so hopeful about that image, that first sign of spring, like everything's starting afresh.
Yeah, and it kind of links their relationship to that natural cycle, doesn't it? That sense of renewal and things coming back around, just like their connection.
Precisely. And then we get that gorgeous, almost sensory detail. His knuckles singing as they reddened in the warmth.
Oh, I love that line. Knuckle singing. So clever. It's that alliteration, isn't it? You can almost hear the sound of it.
And that color imagery, their reddened knuckles after being out in that February cold. It's such a tiny detail, but it really brings it to life, doesn't it?
It does. You can almost feel that warmth yourself. And it's as if even the cold in the distance can't touch that underlying warmth between them, can it? Then the speaker comes in with this really blunt statement. It's not romance, simply how things are. What do you make of that, then?
I reckon that's a pivotal line, especially when we're thinking about that love and relationships theme, because it really sets the tone, doesn't it? It's like she's clarifying what their bond is.
Yeah, it's not some big dramatic love affair.
No, exactly. It's something more settled, more accepted. It's just how things are between them. And it's interesting that she uses that matter-of-fact language, that simple statement. It kind of reflects the speaker's personality a bit, I think, the way she talks about things later on.
Yeah, I see that. And then bam, we get this real contrast drawn between their lives, don't we? You out there in the cold, seeing the seasons turning. Me with my heart full of headlines feeding words onto a blank screen. It's like she's putting their worlds side by side, and they couldn't be more different.
You've got the very tangible, physical reality of being out in the elements, seeing the seasons turning right there in front of you. And then you've got the speaker's world, which feels more abstract, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Like, it's all in her head, almost.
All these headlines, all this information, and yet it all ends up on this blank screen. It's almost as if there's no real end product, nothing tangible to show for all her effort.
Yeah.
And I think that alliteration in Heart Full of Headlines really emphasizes the sheer volume of information she's dealing with compared to the simplicity of seeing the seasons.
It's a good point. And it makes you wonder how they even connect, doesn't it? Their lives are so different. And then she throws in that rhetorical question, is your life more real because you dig and sow?
Ooh, that's a thought-provoking one, isn't it? It's like she's questioning the value of her own existence compared to his.
Yeah, it's almost like she's envious of his connection to nature, that sense of purpose he seems to have.
And maybe there's a sense that she's yearning for that herself. That connection to something more tangible, more real. It's a good one for you lot to think about too, isn't it?
Yep.
Do you reckon one way of life is more real than the other?
That's a big question. Then we get more of that contrasting imagery. Braiding ice, clearing snow in the countryside versus the blank screen in the city. It really highlights those different demands, doesn't it?
It does. And those are such physical, almost violent actions, aren't they? Breaking, clearing. It really emphasizes the effort involved in that kind of life compared to the speaker's more mental work. But then we get that shift, that turning point. Still, it's you who sends me word of that other world pouring air and light into an envelope.
Ah, that's the line, isn't it? It's beautiful. It's like this ordinary act of writing a letter becomes something so much more.
It's almost transformative, isn't it? Despite all that distance and those contrasting lives, it's those letters that bridge the gap between them. That metaphor of pouring air and light into an envelope is just brilliant. It's like those letters are bringing life and energy to the speaker. It's as if she's a bit stifled in the city, and those letters are giving her a breath of fresh air.
It's like they're a lifeline, almost. And then we move into the final stanza, and there's this really noticeable change, isn't there? The way they're described.
Yeah, suddenly it's not about their separate lives anymore. We get so that at night, watching the same news in different houses, it's like they're connected by this shared experience, even though they're miles apart.
And then, bam, that final image. Our souls tap out messages across the icy miles. That's the one that sticks with you, doesn't it?
Icy miles, you'd usually think of that as a barrier, right?
Yeah.
Something negative. But Dooley's clever with it. It's like the cold and the distance can't stop their connection. And that idea of their souls communicating, it suggests something deeper, more spiritual going on.
It does. It's like their connection goes beyond words, beyond the physical. And it ties in nicely with that earlier imagery of the seasons, doesn't it? Even in the winter of their separation, they're still connected.
It's true. And structurally, the poem builds up to that moment, doesn't it? You've got those first four stanzas, each one focusing on their separate lives, as we were saying.
Right. Each stanza is like a little snapshot of their different worlds.
And then that final stanza, it brings them together. It shows how those letters have created this unity, this shared experience. It's really clever how Dooley's done that.
And we see in the pronouns too, don't we? It starts with he, then it's you, and then finally our.
Exactly. It's like their individuality merges into this collective our. It really emphasizes how they've come together through those letters.
What about the shape of the poem on the page, though? Those tercettes, those three-line stanzas, and the way the lines run on without punctuation, that enjambment, what do you reckon those things add? Good question. I guess the tercettes, those short stanzas, maybe they mirror those letters a bit, you know? Like they're little snapshots of their lives.
That's a really good point. And the enjambment, it creates this sense of flow, doesn't it? Like those letters, their thoughts and feelings are flowing into each other, even though there's a physical break on the page. It definitely helps to create that sense of an ongoing conversation.
It does, it does. Now let's have a think about the language. We've touched on a bit of it, but what else stands out to you?
Well, that colloquial language, for one, it's like she's chatting to us, isn't it? Really informal, like that line, it's not romance, simply how things are. It just sounds so natural, so unforced.
It does. And like we said before, those active verbs at the start, digging, planting, they really create that sense of respect for him, don't they? Like he's this capable, grounded person.
Yeah, and the language used to describe him is often quite simple and earthy, isn't it? Dig, sow, ice, snow. And then you've got the speaker, who uses more complex phrases like heart full of headlines, feeding words onto a blank screen. It's almost like their language reflects their worlds. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, it's a good observation. It's almost like his language is more connected to the physical world, while hers is more abstract, more in her head. And there's that alliteration again, isn't there? Heart full of headlines for her, seeing the seasons for him. It's like those repeated sounds emphasize those key aspects of their lives, almost like little echoes.
Yeah, like little reminders of their separate realities. And that matter-of-fact tone we talked about earlier, that could be linked to her being a journalist, couldn't it? That need to be objective and straightforward in her writing.
Yeah, it could be. But for all that distance and the potential for it to be quite a sad poem, it's actually quite uplifting, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it is. It's quite joyful, really. And I think that comes from Dooley's clever use of metaphor. Even when she's talking about distance, those icy miles, she flips it, doesn't she? She makes it about their connection overcoming those obstacles. And that image of pouring air and light into an envelope, it's so positive, so full of hope.
It really is. It's like those letters are bringing something positive into her life. Now, thinking about Maura Dooley herself, she's had a bit of a nomadic life, hasn't she? Lived in loads of different places. How do you think that's fed into the poem?
I reckon it's had a huge impact. Moving between those different environments, urban and rural, it's bound to have shaped her perspective on those contrasting ways of life. And the theme of communication, that's something that comes up a lot in her work, isn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it makes sense if she's had to maintain relationships across distances herself.
Exactly. So even though this poem feels very personal, some people think it's about her relationship with her father, it also taps into these bigger ideas, doesn't it? How we stay connected when our lives are different and we're physically apart.
Right. It's about those universal human experiences. Now, thinking about your GCSE anthology, where you're looking at love and relationships, how does Letters from Yorkshire fit into that bigger picture?
Well, I think it challenges our perceptions a bit, doesn't it? It shows us that love and affection can exist outside of romantic relationships. It's a reminder that connection and intimacy can take many different forms.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's not all hearts and flowers and grand gestures, is it? And the fact that they maintain that connection through letters, it's quite old-fashioned in a way, isn't it? But it really works.
Yeah, it's almost like those letters are a physical manifestation of their bond. And it makes you think about the importance of those small, everyday acts of communication, doesn't it?
It does, it does. Now, if we were to compare it to another poem you might be studying, something like Mother, Any Distance, for example.
Ooh, that's a good one to compare it to. They both deal with maintaining relationships across a distance, don't they? But in very different ways.
Yeah, in Mother, Any Distance, it's that tape measure metaphor, isn't it? That physical connection that's being stretched further and further apart.
Right, and it's about that feeling of growing separation, that anxiety about losing that connection as the distance increases. Whereas in Letters from Yorkshire, it's almost the opposite. There's this sense that those letters are actually bringing them closer together despite the physical miles between them.
Yeah, that's true. It's like in one poem, the gap is widening, and in the other, it's closing. It's interesting how they both explore that theme of distance, but with such different outcomes.
It really highlights the different ways those relationships can evolve, doesn't it? Even though they're both about connection, the nature of that connection and the impact of distance is very different.
That's a good point. Right, so to wrap up our deep dive into Letters from Yorkshire, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think it shows us, doesn't it, that love and connection can thrive even when people's lives are very different and they're physically separated.
Yeah.
It's about finding those ways to bridge the gap, to maintain those bonds despite the challenges.
Yeah, and Dooley's use of imagery, language, and structure, it all comes together to create this really powerful and moving exploration of those themes, doesn't it?
It does. It reminds us that sometimes the simplest things, like writing a letter, can have the biggest impact on our relationships.
Yeah.
And it encourages us to appreciate those small acts of connection, those little things that can make a huge difference in our lives.
It does. It does. And for all of you out there listening, think about the relationships in your own lives, yeah? How do you stay connected with people who are far away or who have different experiences than you? What are those things you do, those little gestures that help to bridge that distance? Maybe it's a text, a phone call, or even, who knows, a good old-fashioned letter. Whatever it is, think about how those everyday actions can help to keep those connections strong.
And maybe have a look at some other poems in your anthology. See how other poets explore those same themes. Because there's a whole world of connection out there waiting to be discovered.
Couldn't put it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll catch you next time.